The winter of 1878 came down on Blackwood Valley like a hammer. It was not a gentle season of picturesque snowfalls and cozy hearths. It was a predator. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, found the smallest cracks in the chinking, and settled deep in the bones of the people who had come to tame that unforgiving land. It was a cold that stole breath, stiffened joints, and turned a man's hope to a brittle shard of ice in his own heart. The settlers, hardy and proud, had built their cabins the way their fathers had, with broad axes and strong backs, laying one notched pine log upon another. They believed in the wisdom of wood, in its solidity and strength. But that winter, the wood failed them. The wind, a ceaseless blade whetted on the northern peaks, scoured the valley day and night. It found the weaknesses in every home, whistling through the gaps between logs that had shrunk in the dry, frigid air. The chinking, a mixture of mud, moss, and horsehair, froze, cracked, and fell away in dusty chunks, opening dozens of tiny mouths that drank the precious warmth from within. Inside the cabins, life became a desperate, losing battle fought on a single front: the fireplace. Families huddled close, feeding the hungry flames with a panic that grew with each passing day. The woodpiles, which had seemed mountainous in the golden light of autumn, dwindled with terrifying speed. The sound of the valley was the howl of the wind and the rhythmic, frantic thud of axes as men ventured into the iron-hard forests to cut more fuel for the insatiable fires. They were burning through their winter supply before the season had even truly taken hold. Frost bloomed on the interior walls, tracing delicate, deadly patterns over the rough-hewn wood. A cup of water left on a table away from the fire would be skimmed with ice by morning. Children coughed a dry, hacking cough, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. It was a universal struggle, a shared misery that bound the community together in a grim fraternity. They all faced the same enemy, and they all fought it with the same tools: more wood, thicker blankets, and a stubborn refusal to admit that their time-honored methods were failing them. To question the log cabin was to question the very foundation of their existence in this new world. It was the shelter that had always worked, the symbol of their conquest over the wilderness. And so they chopped more wood and drew their blankets tighter, ignoring the cold truth that was creeping in around them. Among them lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, her husband taken by a fever 2 springs prior, leaving her with 2 small children, a boy named Liam and a girl, Sarah. She was quiet and observant, a woman whose presence was often overlooked in the boisterous gatherings of the community. They saw her as fragile, a sad figure to be pitied and, when remembered, helped with a share of a hunt or a sack of flour. Her knowledge was not of the axe or the plow, but of the needle and the garden. In a world that valued strength and tradition, her quiet nature was mistaken for weakness, her thoughtfulness for idle dreaming. But Ilara watched, and she listened. She saw the fear in her neighbors' eyes, the exhaustion in their shoulders. She felt the same biting drafts in her own small cabin, and she saw the woodpile her son was too small to replenish shrinking with the same alarming velocity. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the wind, that they would not survive the winter this way. Her children's survival depended not on tradition, but on a truth the valley had yet to learn. The problem was not the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the vessel meant to hold the warmth. It was a sieve, and they were trying to fill it with a thimble. One evening, as she sat patching Liam's worn coat, she watched her breath plume in the air near the wall, far from the fire. She remembered her grandfather, a miller in the old country, a man who worked with stone and grain. He used to talk about the strange properties of things people threw away. He'd once built a small shed for his tools, packing the walls with chaff and husks from the mill, sealing it with a thin layer of lime plaster. He'd claimed it was warmer in winter and cooler in summer than the main house. "Still air," he used to say, tapping his temple. "That's the secret. Still air is the best blanket God ever made." The next morning, an idea began to form, sparked by that distant memory and fueled by the desperation of a mother's love. She walked to the edge of the settlement, to the vast communal fields where the corn had been harvested weeks ago. The stalks stood in skeletal rows, and between them lay great, forgotten mounds of corncobs, tens of thousands of them, stripped of their kernels and left to rot. To everyone else they were garbage, the useless refuse of a bountiful harvest. But Ilara saw something different. She saw a mountain of tiny, hollow chambers. She saw a mountain of trapped air. She saw a blanket. That Sunday, after the circuit preacher had finished his sermon on faith and fortitude, the men gathered near the meeting hall, their talk, as always, turning to the cold and the dwindling wood. It was then that Ilara, clutching her shawl against the wind and her own fear, stepped forward. She spoke in a clear, low voice, a voice unused to commanding attention. She said they were fighting the wrong battle. She said the logs themselves were the problem. They held the cold and bled the heat. Then she revealed her idea. She spoke of building a new kind of wall, a hollow frame filled with the one thing they had in abundance, discarded corn cobs, mixed with clay and lime to bind them. A silence fell over the group. It was the heavy, uncomfortable silence that follows a statement so absurd it momentarily short-circuits the brain. Then a low chuckle started. It was Thomas, the man who had built more cabins in the valley than anyone else. He was a broad, capable man, respected for his skill and his certainty. He looked at Ilara, not with malice, but with the weary condescension of an expert listening to a child. "Corncobs," he said, the word itself sounding ridiculous in his mouth. "Ilara, you want to build a house out of garbage?" The chuckle spread, growing into open, hearty laughter. The men slapped their knees, shaking their heads. A wall of corncobs. It was the most foolish thing they had ever heard. "The first big wind will scatter it across the county," one man guffawed. "Or the mice will eat you out of house and home by Christmas," another added. They offered her their own advice, their voices dripping with pity for the poor, simple-minded widow. They told her to stuff more moss in her walls. They told her to hang heavy blankets over her door. They told her to keep her fire hotter. They told her to stick to what was known, to what was tested. Thomas, softening slightly, placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll help you," he said kindly. "A few of us will come by and re-chink your walls properly. But this idea of yours is a fantasy. It's dangerous." He was trying to protect her from her own folly. But Ilara saw in his eyes the hard, unyielding wall of tradition, a wall far more impenetrable than any she proposed to build. She looked at the circle of laughing, mocking faces, and her resolve hardened. They saw a dreamer. She was a survivor. She pulled her shawl tighter, gave a single, quiet nod, and walked away from their laughter, toward the frozen fields of refuse that held her family's only hope. The next day, the work began. Ilara possessed a small plot of land where her husband had intended to build a larger cabin, a dream that had died with him. All that stood there now was a small, three-sided shed for storing wood. This would be her starting point. She would enclose it, building her new wall as the fourth, and then, if it worked, she would build the others around the existing structure. She did not have the strength to fell great trees or the skill to notch logs, but she had a saw, a hammer, and a will forged in grief and fear. Her first task was the frame. Using the few seasoned timbers her husband had left behind, she began constructing a double wall, a skeleton of studs and plates that left a gap a foot wide between the inner and outer surfaces. Thomas and the other men, riding past on their way to the forest, saw her painstaking work. They saw a lone woman, her small frame straining to lift beams into place, and they shook their heads. "A waste of good lumber," Thomas muttered to his companion, "building a cage for her foolishness." They saw her measuring carefully, ensuring the studs were plumb and the gap was consistent. It looked flimsy to them, a fragile lattice compared to the solid, reassuring bulk of a 4-inch thick pine log. They saw her children, Liam and Sarah, helping in their small ways, holding the end of a board or handing their mother nails. They saw a picture of desperation, not innovation, and it only confirmed their judgment. While the community focused on the urgent, familiar task of patching their existing homes, Elara engaged in a slow, methodical act of creation. After the frame was complete, the real labor began, gathering the cobs. Every morning she and the children would take baskets and a small handcart out to the frozen fields. The sheer scale of the task was daunting. The piles of cobs were huge, but she needed tens of thousands of them. They worked for hours in the biting wind, their fingers growing numb as they sorted through the refuse, picking out the driest, cleanest cobs. The work was monotonous and grueling. The children, though they didn't fully understand, worked with a grim determination, their loyalty to their mother absolute. They knew this was about survival. It was about the cold. It was about the coming dark. Back at the cabin, another process unfolded. Liam, using a heavy mallet, would break the cobs into smaller, fist-sized pieces. Elara, meanwhile, mixed a slurry in a large wooden trough. She used clay she dug from the creek bed before it froze solid, painstakingly hauling it bucket by bucket. She added water and a small amount of precious lime, purchased with the last of her egg money. The lime was the key, her grandfather had said. It would deter pests and help the mixture cure into a hard, stable mass. It was a recipe born of memory and instinct. Then came the most crucial step, packing the wall. She would pour a bucket of the thick, gritty clay slurry into the bottom of the wall cavity, followed by a dense layer of the broken corn cobs. Then, using a long, heavy pole, she and Liam would tamp it down, again and again, compressing the mixture until it was a solid, dense mass. It was exhausting, repetitive work. Each layer had to be packed tightly, eliminating air pockets that could compromise the structure. They could only build up a foot or two each day, as the mixture needed time to begin to dry and set before more weight was added on top. The process was agonizingly slow. Days turned into a week, then 2. The wall rose at a glacial pace. Her neighbors continued their own winter preparations in the traditional way. They spent their days felling trees and splitting logs, their nights stuffing the ever-widening gaps in their cabins with anything they could find, more moss, strips of cloth, even old paper. Their work was a frantic race against the dropping temperature, a series of short-term fixes for a long-term problem. When they saw Elara and her children tamping their strange mixture of mud and garbage into a flimsy wooden frame, they saw a woman who had lost her senses to grief. Their mockery, once loud and public, turned to quiet, pitying whispers. They were finishing their preparations, sealing their homes as best they could, while she was not even halfway done with a single, bizarre wall. They were ready for the winter. She, they believed, was building her own tomb. Elara was aware of their stares, their whispers. She felt their judgment like another layer of the cold. But she did not falter. She focused on the task at hand, on the feel of the tamper in her hands, on the sound of the cobs crunching and settling into the clay. She was not just building a wall, she was building a theory. Each layer of packed cobs was a testament to her grandfather's quiet wisdom. Each bucket of slurry was an act of faith. She was placing her trust not in the brute strength of a log, but in the humble, hidden power of trapped air. She explained it to Liam and Sarah in simple terms as they worked. "Every cob is like a tiny little room," she told them, holding one up. "And we are filling the spaces between the rooms with mud. The cold will have to get through thousands and thousands of little rooms to reach us. It will get tired and give up before it gets inside." The children nodded, their faces smudged with dirt. They understood. Their wall was a fortress of tiny rooms. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks of relentless labor, the wall was finished. It stood a full foot thick, a solid, monolithic structure encased in her wooden frame. The final step was to give it a skin. She mixed a finer plaster of lime, sand, and water, and applied a smooth, clean coat to both the interior and exterior surfaces. It dried to a pale, stony gray. It looked nothing like the other cabins in the valley. It had no visible logs, no lines of chinking. It was plain, seamless, and strange. It looked more like a piece of the earth than a piece of the forest. When Thomas rode by and saw the finished product, he simply stopped, stared for a long moment, and slowly shook his head before riding on. He did not need to speak. His expression said it all. Folly, solidified and plastered over for all to see. The first true test came not with a gradual slide into winter, but with the sudden violence of a storm. It began as a change in the light, the afternoon sun turning a sickly, watery yellow. The air grew unnaturally still, and a deep, oppressive silence fell over the valley, the kind of silence that precedes a cataclysm. The old-timers looked to the bruised purple clouds massing on the northern horizon and felt a primal fear. They called it a white death sky. It was the harbinger of a blizzard that would not just pass through, but settle in and try to choke the life out of the land. By dusk, the storm arrived. It did not come with a roar, but with a hiss. A fine, scouring snow, hard as sand, began to blow horizontally, driven by a wind that rose from a moan to a piercing shriek in the space of an hour. The temperature plummeted. It dropped 10 degrees, then 20, then 30, falling far below zero into a realm of cold that was actively hostile to life. This was not the familiar cold they had been fighting. This was something new, something ancient and merciless. It was a cold that felt like a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on the roofs and squeezed the walls of the cabins, seeking entry with an intelligent, malevolent force. Inside the log cabins of Blackwood Valley, the familiar battle for warmth became a desperate, hopeless siege. The wind, now a physical battering ram, tore away the freshly packed chinking as if it were dry paper. The fine, razor-like snow was driven directly through the gaps, accumulating in ghostly white lines on the floors inside. The fires, which had been merely hungry, became ravenous black holes, devouring wood at a ferocious rate. The intense heat from the hearth created a powerful draft, sucking the frigid air in through the countless new cracks, so that a man could be sweating on one side and freezing on the other. The cabins were no longer shelters. They were wind tunnels, amplifying the misery of the storm. In Thomas's cabin, the situation was dire. As the most respected builder, his home was considered the strongest, the best built in the valley. But the storm made a mockery of his expertise. A long crack appeared in one of the main logs with a sound like a pistol shot, the wood contracting violently in the extreme cold. Frost, thick as sheep's wool, crept down the walls from the ceiling. His wife and children were huddled together under a mountain of blankets, their teeth chattering uncontrollably. Thomas stood before his fireplace, his face grim, piling on log after log. The heat roared up the chimney, but the cold poured in from every other direction. He was burning through a week's worth of wood in a single night. He was a master of his craft, a man who had tamed the forest with his axe and his will. But he was losing. He was wrong. The bitter wind, whistling through his own expertly notched logs, was screaming the truth at him. Meanwhile, in Ilara's small, strange cabin, something remarkable was happening. Almost nothing. The wind shrieked and howled outside, a wild beast throwing itself against the walls. But inside, it was just a distant, muffled roar. The plastered walls did not whistle or moan. There were no drafts. The fine snow piled up against the exterior, and instead of being a threat, it became part of the defense, another layer of insulation over the thick, solid wall. The single wall Ilara had built now formed the back of her small, enclosed living space. The other three sides were still the old shed walls, but she had banked them high with earth and snow, reinforcing them as best she could. The core of her home's defense was the corncob wall, and it was holding. The air inside was not hot, not like the blistering, uneven heat of the other cabins. It was a steady, gentle, and pervasive warmth. The small iron stove in the corner did not roar. It glowed with a soft, cherry-red contentment. Ilara had put a single, medium-sized log on the fire hours ago, and it was still burning slowly, steadily. The thermal mass of the thick wall was doing its job, absorbing the heat from the stove and radiating it back into the room slowly and evenly. The temperature inside was a comfortable 60 degrees. The air was still. There was no frost on the walls. Sarah and Liam were not huddled in fear. They were asleep in their small beds, breathing the easy, peaceful breaths of children who feel safe and warm. Ilara sat in her rocking chair, mending a sock, the only sounds the quiet crackle of the stove and the distant, impotent fury of the storm. It worked. Her fortress of tiny rooms, her wall of garbage, it had worked. For 2 days and 2 nights, the White Death raged. In the main settlement, conditions went from desperate to deadly. Several families ran out of firewood completely and began burning furniture to stay alive. The well froze over, and men risked their lives in the whiteout to chop at the ice. The community, once bound by shared confidence, was now a collection of isolated islands of fear. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally began to subside. The silence that followed was just as terrifying. It was the silence of a world buried alive. Thomas, his own firewood gone, his family shivering and sick in a cabin that was now barely above freezing, knew he had no choice. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. His children's lives were at stake. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, he stepped out into a landscape of monstrous white drifts and fought his way through the waist-deep snow, his destination the one place he had dismissed as utter madness, the widow Ilara's cabin. The journey was a brutal, exhausting struggle. The snow was so deep and soft that each step was a battle. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. As he neared her small home, he saw a sight that stopped him in his tracks. From every other chimney in the valley, there was no smoke at all. Their fires were out. But from Ilara's small, mud-caked chimney, a thin, lazy ribbon of pale gray smoke curled calmly into the still air. It was not the frantic, billowing smoke of a desperate fire. It was the smoke of a fire that was tamed, controlled, and efficient. It was the smoke of victory. He stumbled the last few yards to her door and knocked, his knuckles numb. The door opened, and the first thing that struck him was not a blast of heat, but a wall of calm, steady warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but the gentle, even warmth of a sun-warmed stone. He saw Ilara, her expression calm, her hands busy with some knitting. He saw her children at a small table, drawing on a slate, their cheeks rosy and healthy. There was no panic here, no desperation, only a profound, unbelievable peace. He stepped inside, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the stove, where a single small log was burning with a quiet hiss. He looked at the walls, smooth and pale. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and placed it on the interior of the new wall. It was not cold. It was not even cool. It felt neutral, solid, and utterly impenetrable. It was holding back the deadliest winter in living memory, as if it were a mild spring breeze. He looked from the wall to Ilara's face, and all the pride, all the mockery, all the certainty that had defined him, crumbled into dust. He, the master builder, stood in a cabin colder than a tomb. She, the foolish widow, had created a sanctuary. He was wrong. It was a simple, devastating, and liberating truth. He was so utterly, completely, and dangerously wrong. He did not have to say a word. The shock and awe were plain on his face. Ilara simply looked at him, her gaze not triumphant, but filled with a quiet, compassionate understanding. She had no need to say, "I told you so." The warmth of the room said it for her. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft. His name was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. He pulled off his snow-caked hat, his breath catching in his throat. "Ilara," he began, his own voice hoarse and cracked. "My fire is out. My children, we are freezing." He had expected scorn, or at the very least, a moment of bitter satisfaction on her part. He had earned it. But she gave him neither. She simply nodded toward the space by the stove. "Bring them here," she said. "There is room." It was an offer of grace so pure and unconditional, it almost brought him to his knees. He turned without another word and plunged back into the snow, his heart a turmoil of shame, gratitude, and a dawning, world-altering respect. He returned minutes later with his wife and 2 sons, all of them wrapped in blankets, their faces blue with cold. As they stumbled into the warmth of Ilara's cabin, their reaction was the same as his, stunned silence. They huddled near the stove, soaking in the gentle heat, their shivering slowly subsiding. Within the hour, another family arrived, their own home no longer habitable. Then another. Ilara's small cabin, the object of so much ridicule, became an ark in the frozen wasteland of the valley. She welcomed them all, sharing her small store of stew and her seemingly endless supply of warmth. She did not boast, she did not lecture. She simply moved among her new guests with a quiet dignity, ensuring everyone was cared for. Her triumph was not loud. It was as quiet and steady as the heat radiating from her remarkable wall. When the storm finally broke completely and the pale sun emerged, the valley began to thaw, both literally and figuratively. Word of what had happened, of the survival of Thomas's family and the others inside the Corncob cabin, spread like wildfire. Neighbors, who had spent the last 3 days in abject misery, began to make their way over, their curiosity overcoming their pride. They came in ones and twos, their faces etched with skepticism, but also with a desperate hope. They would stand at her doorway, peering in, and then, hesitantly, step inside. Each person had the same reaction. First, the shock at the pervasive, even warmth. Then, the inevitable, amazed touch of the hand against the wall. They would rap their knuckles on it, expecting a hollow sound, but would be met with a solid, satisfying thud. They saw the tiny, efficient fire, the healthy children, and the calm woman at the center of it all. The whispers of mockery were replaced by murmurs of awe. Thomas was the first to break the respectful silence. He had stayed through the night, watching, observing, his builder's mind trying to deconstruct the miracle around him. He approached Ilara as she was ladling broth into a bowl. "How?" he asked, his voice low and humbled. "I don't understand. It defies everything I know about building." He was no longer the confident expert. He was a student, asking for knowledge from the master. This moment, more than any other, signified the profound shift that had occurred. The patriarch of the old way was bowing to the matriarch of the new. Ilara put down the ladle and walked with him to the wall. She tapped it gently with her knuckles. "You believe in the strength of a single, solid thing," she explained, her voice as calm as ever. "You think a thick log is strong, but its strength is also its weakness. The cold travels right through it. The log fights the cold, and it loses." She then gestured around the room. "This wall doesn't fight the cold. It baffles it. It gives it a maze to get lost in." She picked up a leftover piece of corncob from a basket. Thousands of these, each one filled with tiny pockets of air. The cold has to get through one pocket, then the next, then the next. The clay holds it all together, and the lime keeps it dry and strong. The heat from the stove warms the inside of this thick wall, and the wall holds that warmth like a stone left in the sun. It doesn't let it go. She spoke of thermal mass and trapped air, not in the language of engineers, but in the simple, clear language of a baker explaining a recipe. It was knowledge born not of books, but of observation, memory, and necessity. Thomas listened, his face a study in concentration. He ran his hands over the smooth plaster, feeling the faint warmth it held. He nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. It was elegant, it was brilliant, and the materials had been lying in the fields for free, dismissed as worthless. He looked at the other men who had gathered, their faces showing the same dawning comprehension. The laughter they had showered upon her weeks ago now seemed like the braying of fools. He turned back to Alara, his eyes meeting hers. "Teach me," he said. It was not a request, it was a plea. "Teach us all." And so she did. As the valley thawed and the great drifts of snow began to melt, Alara's cabin became a schoolhouse. She held no formal classes, but every day people would come to her, Thomas foremost among them, with questions. She showed them the ratio of clay to lime. She demonstrated the technique of tamping the cobs. She explained why the double frame was so important. She shared her knowledge as freely and generously as she had shared her warmth, asking for nothing in return. There was no hint of arrogance in her, no sense of vindication. She was a woman who had solved a problem to protect her children, and her solution had saved them all. That was reward enough. That spring, a new sound filled Blackwood Valley. It was not the sound of axes felling massive trees for logs. It was the sound of saws cutting studs for double frames, the sound of hammers building the skeletons of a new kind of home. The first project was to retrofit Thomas's own cabin. He, with Alara's quiet guidance, tore down his own expertly built log walls, one by one, and replaced them with the new method. The men who had once laughed beside him now worked alongside him, hauling clay, breaking cobs, and mixing slurry. The women and children, who had once pitied Alara's strange obsession, now spent their days gathering the cobs from the fields, recognizing them not as trash, but as the valley's most valuable building material. One by one, the cabins were transformed. Some built entirely new homes. Others, like Thomas, replaced their log walls within the existing footprint. By the time the first snows of 1879 began to fall, the settlement looked different. The rustic, iconic log cabins were mostly gone, replaced by simple, solid-looking homes with plastered gray or earthen-toned walls. They were not as picturesque, perhaps, but they were fortresses against the cold. They called them Alara walls, though she herself discouraged the name, simply calling it the warm wall method. The idea spread. A government surveyor, charting the territory, was forced to winter in the valley that year. He arrived a skeptic, having heard tales of the Corncob houses, and prepared himself for a miserable few months. He was housed with Thomas's family and was astonished by the comfort and warmth of the home, and by the tiny amount of firewood it consumed. He spent the winter taking meticulous notes, drawing diagrams of the wall's construction, and interviewing Ellada. When he left in the spring, he took the story with him. His official report contained a lengthy section on the Blackwood method, praising its ingenuity, efficiency, and use of local materials. Newspapers in the East picked up the story, printing sensationalized articles about the frontier widow who built a house from corn husks. The idea, born of quiet desperation, began its journey across the plains, adopted by settlers in other harsh climates who faced the same life-or-death struggle against the cold. Ellada never sought recognition or fame. She remained in Blackwood Valley, raising her children in the quiet warmth of her small, sturdy home. Her greatest satisfaction came from the simple sights and sounds of the following winters. The sight of lazy plumes of smoke rising from every chimney. The sound of children laughing and playing indoors, warm and safe. And the absence of the frantic, fearful chopping of axes that had once defined the season. She had faced down the scorn of her community and the fury of nature, armed with nothing more than an old memory, a discarded resource, and a mother's unwavering will to protect her own. The legacy of the Corncob Wall was not just about survival. It was a lesson in humility. It taught the proud, self-reliant people of the valley that wisdom is not always loud. It does not always reside in tradition or in the strongest arm. Sometimes it is found in the quietest voice, in the observant eye that sees value where others see only waste. It taught them that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest, and that true strength lies not in resisting nature, but in understanding it. The winter of 1878 came down on Blackwood Valley like a hammer, but it broke on a wall of garbage, and in doing so, forged a community that was warmer, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. This story reminds us that the greatest innovations often arise from the humblest of circumstances, driven not by a desire for fame or fortune, but by the simple, powerful need to solve a fundamental problem. It is a testament to the power of quiet observation, the courage to defy convention, and the profound wisdom that can be found in listening to the lessons of the past and applying them with ingenuity to the challenges of the present. If this story reminded you of the strength found in quiet wisdom, share it with someone who believes in the power of a good idea, no matter how strange it first appears. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and wisdom.